Welcome to a brand new podcast. Ian McLean is a writer and the author of TJ's War. David Blair is an actor and the narrator of the audiobook TJ's War. David and Ian have been listening to their readers and listeners and have decided to turn TJ's War into a movie. And since the story covers the entirety of World War II, the movie will cost at least $50 million. Will David and Ian succeed in their quest? Follow them in this podcast series. We're going to make a $50 million movie.
Hey, here we are for another fabulous edition of We're Making a $50 million TV show or movie, and it's probably going to be more than $50 million. But nevertheless, here we are. And we thought we would do some topical episode. We've talked about the story of TJ's War. That's the novel we're turning into a movie. But let's talk about World War II itself. And Ian, through his research, is a bit of an expert on the topic. We want to discuss today the period leading up to World War II, 1930 to 1939, and that includes both, like, how does a guy like Hitler come into power? How does he get elected? And which might be a timely topic considering current events around the world today, and but also what's going on in Britain at the time, 1930 to 39. What are the British perspectives of what's happening in Germany and what might happen, not knowing yet fully what will happen in World War II? You know, what were the apprehensions to going to war, or were the Britons ready to go to war? I don't really know that much, and so Ian will shed some light on that. I don't want to do all the talking. I'm joined today by David Blair, who also has prepared a list of questions for Ian and our expert Ian McLean. David, why don't you get us started off? What would you like to know?
As is often the case with these things, Ian, when we're just chatting about the book or anything surrounding that world, Ian just starts coming out with these amazing stories about either TJ or the research that he's spent decades doing that led to the book in the first place. So, in a way, I've got some ideas ready, but in a way, I don't want to get in the way of Ian and stuff that may come out. So we'll see. We'll see where we end up meandering to. And it's all about the journey anyway, isn't it?
Before we really get into the meat of this subject, can I just say that I'm now in my 47th year of working, and I've learned 3 great rules of business, of life really, from those 47 years. And the first is, and these are all learnt the hard way, by the way, first rule is never buy somebody else's business, because they're always selling it for the reason they're not telling you. The second is never use bank money, because a bank never keeps your secrets. It's in their interest to pass your secrets across to some of their other clients or whatever. And my third rule is never trust an expert. So the hairs in the back of my neck go up when you call me an expert.
I was going to actually bolster your credentials because of what David said about you've studied it for 4 decades. That's longer than, people who have PhDs that teach this topic in history departments at prestigious universities. I think you do qualify as an expert. I know that you've devoted your life to studying this topic. So
okay, well, that's about to be disproved, but let's see how we get on.
Well, let me ask you then, because I sort of alluded to it in the intro there, because I have studied about how Hitler's rise in Germany, but something I don't know much about and that I'm curious about, how did Britain and other European countries initially view Hitler's rise at the time in the early 30s? Was he seen as a threat right away? Was it evident what was going to play out?
Not really. The history of this is it doesn't really start in a single spot, and there are a number of levers going on, a number of drivers going on. So the German mentality is very, very important. The Second Reich had just been demolished during the First World War, and the Allies had got together at the end of the war in 1919 in Versailles. We had the Americans with Wilson, the president, and then Lloyd George for the UK. There was a chap from Italy, and Clemenceau from France. And France in particular, through Clemenceau, were so angry with the Germans that while Wilson wanted to allow, particularly Wilson wanted to allow the Germans to recover because they were decimated by the First World War. But he was stopped from doing this by Clemenceau, who wanted revenge. And so what was left of Germany was absolutely raped, especially by France, in terms of the mineral rights that they took from the Germans, and the land that they took from the Germans, and the other resources that they had. So it was extremely difficult for the Germans to recover. And instead of recovering, they actually went downhill from the end of the First World War.
Let me just ask real quick. What was Wilson's motivation in not wanting that outcome for Germany?
Because if you take a country and you destroy it to that level, then you've got to go back in and support it. Then it becomes
well, I get it. That's what happened in Iraq.
That needs to recover. You've got a massive humanitarian disaster on your hands, and that was obvious from 1919 onwards.
There's a famous line that Colin Powell told George W. Bush before 2003 that said if you break something like if you break it, you bought it, or it's along the lines of that if you destroy Iraq, then you're going to have to take on the responsibility of rebuilding it, and that's
that's true, but he didn't kind of follow through. It just kind of left.
Well, I know, and I don't want to get us talking about a war that happened 80 years later, but anyway.
It's a really good point, Mark, because what we're really doing, and what I'd love us to stop doing, is repeating history, and we keep doing it.
Luck.
We don't learn.
Yeah.
So Germany, all the way through the 20s, went downhill. A massive inflation and ridiculous. You need a wheelbarrow of cash to buy a pack of cigarettes, all that kind of stuff. And while that's going on, there's other things happening to take the other country's attention away from Germany. Germany was like Iraq. We just forgot about it. We just, okay, well, that's dealt with. We'll move on and we'll forget about it. And Germany was just like that. But the culture of Germany, with its Wagner rings, mythology, and so on, which is very similar to Scandinavian mythology with the gods of Thor and so on. They had this belief system that was still there, and so if you got the right guy to come along and appeal to those triggers within the German population, it was ripe for the taking. So Hitler knew this, and a lot of his speeches in the late 20s and early 30s were around pulling at their heartstrings in this kind of way to say, no, we are the German race. We can do this. Think of our ancestry. Think of our history. And we had created the situation where Hitler could take that kind of power. And
it's easy for us to look with hindsight at the extent to which Hitler eventually went was abhorrent, obviously. But when there's just someone standing up, say around 1930, saying we've been made to grovel and our country is a shadow of its former self and we don't deserve that, and I'm sort of very much pro-you, pro-Germany, and I'll rebuild us to give us some pride again, people are going to follow that. They're going to say,
absolutely.
Great.
And it's not, and it's not that it's not obvious. we think, well, in hindsight, maybe they didn't appreciate that at the time. But Hitler followed the exact model of Napoleon. Napoleon was able to take a completely demolished France after the French Revolution and build it back up in exactly the same way. And so,
what was the British?
We see repeated, dare I say it, around the world today.
Yes.
I mean, in the UK, you've got
we see it.
The likes of Farage.
We can see lots of examples of this now. Absolutely.
It's one thing to rebuild economically, like the Japanese did after World War II, but we're talking after World War I, and Germany is, I guess, putting the pieces back together. But Hitler even part of his campaign is rearmament, right? And in defiance of that Treaty of Versailles. Correct? What was the British perception of the German rearmament throughout the 30s?
So, again, there's a number of factors going on. Wilson came back to the US and could not get his own people to agree to America being part of the League of Nations. So, at the end of the day, America didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles. They signed the Treaty of Berlin, which said, essentially, we take all the benefits, etc., of the Treaty of Versailles, but they left out joining the League of Nations. So America never joined the League of Nations, which meant that the most powerful member of the group wasn't part of that organization that was put in place to keep track of Germany. And meanwhile, Britain's having its own problems. It's got it begins to look internally. It's having to recover from the First World War. The Labour Party became a much stronger force because the working class and the middle class realized that the upper class weren't looking after them. They'd basically thrown them in front of bullets all the way through the 1914-18 war. So the whole structure was in danger of falling apart within the UK, and other countries had their own issues. So we basically took our eye off the ball with Germany, and one of Britain's greatest exports is weapons. So if the Germans are going to buy weapons, I mean they made a lot of their own secretly, but if they're going to buy some, Britain's very happy to sell to anyone who's got the money. So we weren't afraid of Hitler as a nation in the early 30s. We were very much encouraging him. We would go off and visit him and call him Herr Hitler and be very happy to walk alongside him and so on. So the atmosphere during the early 30s for the British government especially was they were very happy with Hitler. Hitler was building roads, the
he wasn't
autobahns.
in charge then, was he?
Say again?
He wasn't the Chancellor then?
He became the Chancellor in 1933. And 66% of the German voting population voted for him. 66%.
And who was Prime Minister of the UK? Was that Chamberlain that early, or was Chamberlain later?
Was much later. It was Ramsay MacDonald. And he was Labour.
And I have so many questions. I don't want to bounce around all over the place, but you were talking about the Brits selling weaponry to the Germans before World War II. But I mean, the Germans aren't using British weapons against the British, right? And I mean, I guess my question, or the gap I have in my knowledge of this part of history, the Germans by World War II had superior firepower, right? They had those Panzer tanks or whatever that were way more powerful than what the Allies had. And where did that come from? If Germany had been dismantled, so to speak, after World War I, how do they build up the strongest army in the world?
Doesn't take long.
Just over time, well, I guess not. Okay, I guess that answers the question. Just with determination, I guess is what I'm asking. With determination and, I mean, intellect.
A lot of it was in secret. So you've got all these laws, but if there's nobody out there, I mean, the number of people who will commit a crime if they think they won't get caught is well over 50%. And in Germany, that's exactly how they felt. Okay, the law is that we don't make weapons, but if no one's watching us, if there is no policeman out there, then we're going to go ahead and do it. And that's exactly what Hitler did. And he surrounded himself with henchmen who would allow him to become more and more powerful. And the German population, 66% of them, of the voting public, voted for Hitler in 1933. So
a lot.
They loved him. They loved him because he was taking them out of their poverty, and he was able to push the Aryan race and the dominance of the German people to Germany, and he was giving them a ray of light after the torture that the Allies had effectively put the Germans through during the 1920s and the end of the war.
And at what point, Ian, there were various sort of pivotal things that he started to do, weren't there? Because he did all this quite gradually in taking away press freedoms and in terms of removing other parties from the scene politically. And before we get into the kind of heavier, serious bit in 37, 38, what were the pivotal moments that people might have thought, okay, well, that's not so good, but the countries watching on might have thought...
He established these things fairly quickly.
We should have done something then.
Yeah, he established a lot of these things fairly quickly. He had the brown shirts who would go off and very brutally enforce his ways of thinking. And that can happen very quickly. We've just had a Labour government take over from the Conservatives, and within a couple of weeks, there was a major escalation of trouble, where people were saying that, they called them the far right. They weren't necessarily the far right. They were simply saying, look, we've got too many immigrants here, etc. And Starmer, who's the Prime Minister now under the Labour government, locked up a large number of people for stating opinions. He also locked up a large number of people for being violent. But some people weren't violent. They just stated opinions that were against, that other people found offensive. And that is a form of censorship of free speech, which is what the Second World War was all about, to try and protect freedom of speech and freedom in general. So you can do this fairly. If you're in power, you can start to go down a path which is very dangerous very quickly. And I think that never mind anywhere else right now, I think we have to watch what's going on in the UK very carefully, because it's getting to the point where people are afraid to say what they think. And that's exactly what happened in Germany.
How was the press covering this? How did the British press cover this rise? I mean, did it influence public opinion?
Well, the only press barons who were against it weren't British. So Beaverbrook's Canadian, and he had a number of newspapers in the UK, and he was I'm not sure who fed who. He was a great friend of Churchill's, and between Churchill and Beaverbrook, they kept pointing out issues that were going on with Hitler. But in general, the German propaganda machine, because Hitler realized right at the start that propaganda was a really important tool. Most British media were very complimentary of Hitler. And at the same time, were not at all complimentary of Churchill. Churchill was in his wilderness years from 1929, and he was making these broadcasts to America regularly and saying, and quite a number of them, he was saying, look, we need to do something about this build-up of power that is in the hands of this man in Germany, this Mr. Hitler, and he was generally ignored.
I wanted to ask about Churchill. I've just finished a very good book by Robert Harris called Precipice,
Yep.
which is all about, which is set in the First World War, the lead up to the First World War. And Churchill was around then as a relatively young politician. And I think he had a rather forgettable military career. Went into politics instead. I might be a little shaky on my facts there. But anyway, Churchill is portrayed in this book as being quite tub-thumping, warmongering, wanting to a bit of saber rattling and wanting to kind of get stuck in and please let me go out there and I'll lead. What is that your understanding? And when it came to the period we're talking about, 30 to 39, what was Churchill doing then? What was his role?
Okay, well, I'll have to read this thing by Harris because it doesn't sound right. So it's true to say that before the First World War, he didn't have much of a military career. He had joined the army immediately after leaving school, but he came out and became a journalist instead. Now, as a journalist, he attended the last cavalry charge in the Battle of Omdurman, if I've pronounced that properly, and witnessed incredible carnage and loss of life. And it sickened him. And when you read the reports of this that he wrote, he was very clearly sickened by any kind of war, really. He was not a warmonger. In the First World War, he became Lord of the Admiralty and took responsibility for the failed battle of the Dardanelles, where thousands of men were washed up on the shores of Gallipoli. Now he took responsibility for that as Lord of the Admiralty, but he actually tried to stop that from going ahead before it happened, because he could see the danger. He then left politics, having fallen on his sword, and joined the Royal Scots in 1916 as a captain and went out to the front. So I'm not sure if that was a suicidal thing, but it certainly seemed to be suicide for him to do that at that time, because nobody was lasting very long at all in the First World War in 1916. It just so happened that when he was out there, there wasn't a lot of action. There was some, but there wasn't a lot. And so he survived. And he was also very well liked by his troops because he really looked after them well. And so Lloyd George called him back into government, and he became the Minister for Supply. And he actually was responsible for inventing the tank. He'd realized during his time out in the front that a mechanized gun that could move forward by under its own power would be a real game changer. And that's exactly what it was. It was a massive game changer. And he invented it. So a massive brain on this man. And he that helped to finish the First World War. Now, by the early 30s, Hitler was clearly a problem. And Churchill was not saber rattling. He wanted to stop. He wanted to stop this war before it started, but he said it's going to start and it's going to go ahead because there's nothing to stop it. Britain has got rid of its forces. It's put all its soldiers, most of its soldiers, back in civilian clothes. It's stopped the factories that were producing weapons. It stopped the aircraft production and so on. Britain is defenseless, and any good soldier will tell you that it's about defense, and in defense you must have a deterrent that will stop the enemy from starting to attack you in the first place. And Churchill was saying exactly that, but he was not being listened to.
Yeah, that's my thoughts as well, David. Like, how if each side is enthusiastic about deterring the other side, I mean, what's to stop just perpetual buildup until you have?
Well, that happened.
You know, All right, but well, except the Germans were the British weren't keeping up with the Germans in
No,
terms
sorry,
of
I mean, I meant later on, kind of
in the
when
Cold
we
War.
came out of exactly Cold War, and then in the 80s, the arms race, and all of that. Yeah.
Right, it gets to the point there's like where you
Wh-
have to go ahead.
I was just going to say, just diving on what you were saying just now, Ian. There was also, I think, a sense that the thought that anything as horrific as the First World War could ever happen again was just surely we will never, no one would ever want to go there again. So,
Yeah.
watching this guy build up the army, okay, well, fair enough. But the thought that anyone would want to go there again was anathema.
Completely, and not least because Britain, as one example, we lost 1 million men in the First World War. There wasn't probably a home in the country that wasn't impacted one way or the other by the First World War, and certainly did not want to do it again. Was sickened by it, and rather than face up to what was going on elsewhere, had basically shut the door, almost as if they stuck their head in the sand.
What are the losses in the Second World War for the UK?
For the UK, around about 300,000.
There was greater loss of life in the First World War.
For Britain, yes, but as Britain as a country, when you take into account the allies of Britain, we then get up to much higher numbers. India lost over 1 million.
Okay, and I mean the 6 million Jews. The loss of life.
We can get up to 60 million loss of life across the world in World War II.
Right. Okay. Well, fellas, that will do it for our time for part 1. Let's take a break, and then we'll come back and discuss the remainder of the 1930s leading up to World War II.
To find out more about the book, visit tjswar.com. And to buy it, click on the Amazon link below. To accompany us on our journey, please subscribe to this podcast because we're going to make a $50 million movie.